Welcome to Fantasy and Frames Mental Health Awareness Series. I'm your host, Zach, at FF Batman. Fantasy and Frames fully supports mental health awareness. This series will come out every Monday morning through the summer on our YouTube channel. So subscribe and hit the bell so you do not miss any episodes. We will discuss a specific topic in each episode. If you have any questions, please leave a comment or feel free to DM me if you'd like to keep it private. I could not think of a better person to talk about mental health with than an expert, my wife, Megan. So this episode, we are talking about setting boundaries. I do not want to make any assumptions about anyone watching, so let's start with the basics. What are boundaries?
Personal boundaries are the limits and rules we set for ourselves within relationships. Most people have a mix of boundary types. For instance, someone can have healthy boundaries at work, porous boundaries in friendships, rigid boundaries in romantic relationships, and a mix of all three types within their family. The appropriateness of boundaries depends heavily on the setting. What's appropriate when you're out with friends might not be appropriate when you're at work. Some cultures may have different expectations when it comes to boundaries. For instance, it may be wildly inappropriate to express emotions publicly in one culture, whereas another encourages emotional expression.
All right, so you used a few different terms that some people may not be familiar with. Can you describe someone with rigid boundaries?
A person who keeps others at a distance is said to have rigid boundaries. Typically, they have few close relationships. They may seem detached from others. They keep others at a distance to avoid the possibility of rejection. They may even avoid intimacy or closer relationships. They are protective of personal information, and they are unlikely to ask for help. In toxic relationships, it is a necessity to have rigid boundaries, or else the toxicity will continue to cause harm. But that is only the exception to what we will be discussing today.
Great. Can you describe someone with porous boundaries?
A person who tends to get too involved with others is said to have porous boundaries. Typically, they overshare personal information. They are over-involved with others' problems. They are dependent on the opinions of others. They have difficulty saying no to the requests of others. They fear rejection if they do not comply with others. And they may even be accepting of abuse or disrespect.
All right, so what is the goal of boundaries?
The goal is to have healthy boundaries where you can share personal information in an appropriate way. Know your personal wants and needs and actually communicate them. Value your opinions. Don't compromise your values for others, and accept when others say no to you. Sometimes distinguishing between healthy, porous, and rigid boundaries can be difficult. So I tell my clients to focus on reciprocity. If you are giving too much, you have porous boundaries. If you are putting up a wall and not giving enough, you have rigid boundaries. If there is an equal give and take in the relationship, regardless if it's a lot or a little, then you have healthy boundaries.
Okay, so you talked about 3 traits of boundaries. Now, what are the different types?
Just as there are universal emotions everyone feels across the world, there are also universal boundary types everyone experiences. So we talked about, as you said, the rigid, porous, and healthy traits of boundaries. Amongst each of these is different types of boundaries that we are going to discuss. So the first boundary is physical boundaries, which refer to personal space and physical touch. Healthy physical boundaries include an awareness of what's appropriate and what's not in various settings and relationships. For instance, knowing when to greet someone with a handshake, a hug, or a kiss. Physical boundaries are violated when someone touches you when they don't, or when you don't want them to, or when they invade your personal space, such as rummaging through your bedroom.
Okay, physical boundaries seem fairly straightforward. So what is the next boundary type?
Intellectual boundaries refer to thoughts and ideas. Healthy intellectual boundaries include respect for others' ideas and an awareness of appropriate discussion. For instance, you know exactly who you can talk to controversial topics pertaining to politics and social justice issues, or who you should just talk to about the weather. Intellectual boundaries are violated when someone dismisses or belittles your thoughts or ideas, such as when they have a different opinion or perception.
Okay, the intellectual boundary seems a little more complicated, but I'm following what you're saying. Can you tell me the next boundary type?
Emotional boundaries refer to emotions. Healthy emotional boundaries include limitations on when to share and when not to share personal information. For instance, gradually sharing personal information during the development of a relationship, as opposed to revealing everything to everyone, such as a random stranger in public, which I think we have all experienced that uncomfortable moment where a stranger shares their entire life story in a situation that you just can't seem to escape, like the checkout line at a store. Emotional boundaries are violated when someone criticizes, belittles, or invalidates another person's feelings. This boundary type tends to come up the most in therapy due to people getting uncomfortable, acting defensive, or even attacking others for sharing emotions they don't have the emotional maturity to handle for one reason or another. Everyone is entitled to their own experience, regardless of if the other person agrees with that emotional reaction or not.
Okay, that makes sense that emotional boundaries come up the most in therapy. Emotions are so complex, and they get even more complex when you are sharing or receiving emotions with someone else. That could lead to plenty of boundary violations as people tend to struggle with handling someone else's emotions. On to the next boundary type.
Sexual boundaries refer to the emotional, intellectual, and physical aspects of sexuality. Healthy sexual boundaries involve mutual understanding and respect for limitations and desires between sexual partners. Sexual boundaries are violated with unwanted sexual touch, pressure to engage in sexual acts, leering, or sexual comments. Thus, sexual boundaries exist in every relationship from partners to family, friends, coworkers, and random strangers you meet in passing. For instance, you have to re up your sexual harassment in the workplace training every year for a reason.
Okay, that's a great description. I wanted to add that there is a stereotype that males in general are down for anything at any time. That simply is not true. Just like women, each guy needs to understand what their sexual boundaries are for themselves. Then they need to communicate those boundaries with their partner. You should never assume someone else's sexual boundaries. So let's move on to the next boundary type.
Material boundaries refer to money and possessions. Healthy material boundaries involve setting limits on what you will share and with whom. For instance, it may be appropriate to lend a car to a family member, assuming they will drive safely, return it on time, and refill the gas used. But it's probably not appropriate to lend a car to someone you just met. Material boundaries are violated when someone steals or damages another person's possessions, or when they pressure you to give or lend them your possessions.
Perfect. Material boundaries sound pretty obvious after you explained it. What is the last boundary type?
Time boundaries refer to how a person uses their time. Healthy time boundaries require setting aside enough time for each facet of your life, such as work, relationships, and hobbies. Time boundaries are violated when another person demands too much of your time. Only you can choose how best you want to spend your time, even if it's engaging in self sabotaging behaviors.
Okay, just my opinion, but I think a lot of people let their time boundaries get violated, and they might not even realize that they are letting this happen. In the fantasy football space, there's a lot of discussion about balancing your time between your full-time job, your partner and or your family, and creating fantasy football content. Each person is unique, so there's not a single correct answer, but I wanted to highlight the importance of knowing what your boundaries are so you can protect them. Now that we know what boundaries are, can you give us some tips for having healthy boundaries?
So, some tips for healthy boundaries are to know your limits and values, listen to your emotions, have respect for yourself and others, be assertive, and consider the long view. So, let's break those down a little bit. Knowing your limits before becoming involved in a situation is important. You want to be as specific as possible with what is acceptable to you and what is not to avoid getting pulled into that trap of giving just a little bit more over and over until you've given far too much. Knowing your values can help you identify your limits, as we tend to protect the things most important to us. Listening to your emotions and understanding what your feelings are telling you can alert that you are feeling uncomfortable or resentful when someone is taking advantage of you. Having respect for yourself ensures your boundaries are not too open or you are elevating others' needs above your own. Having respect for others ensures your actions aren't self-serving or at the expense of others. So instead of trying to win or take as much as possible, consider what's fair to everyone or risk losing the relationship entirely. Being assertive involves being able to clearly and respectfully say no, or finding a healthy and respectful compromise for everyone involved. Considering the long view involves considering that some days you will give more than you take, and other days you will take more than you give, but knowing it all evens out in the end. However, if you find you are always giving or taking, then there is a problem that needs to be explored further.
Okay. I'm going to use a silly example to help illustrate your tips for our fantasy football audience. The concept of knowing your boundaries is like knowing how many leagues you should be in. That number is different for everyone. However, if you do not know what your limit is and you don't start saying no to league requests, then you end up in way too many leagues. That season won't be as much fun for you because of all those extra commitments. Will add on more stress and more waiver decisions and start-sit decisions. It is a balancing act of knowing your limit without having to overextend yourself to find it.
I often tell my clients how important it is to regularly explore boundaries since they are constantly changing and evolving with us. For visual learners, I recommend making an Excel chart with the columns representing various relationships in your life, such as your partner, parents, extended family, friends, coworkers, neighbors, etc., and the rows representing the 6 types of relationships we discuss: physical, intellectual, emotional, sexual, material, and time. Instead of writing descriptions, I tell them to color code the boxes of the chart. Healthy boundaries are represented by your favorite color or even your favorite team logo. And porous and rigid boundaries are each represented by their own color or team logo that you dislike. When your chart is complete, you will see a sea of color. You will be more motivated to correct the colors of porous and rigid that you dislike. And you will also be able to visualize clear patterns. Do you have a certain column or relationship that are more problematic than others? Or do you have problems with certain boundary types that you need to explore deeper within yourself?
So spreadsheets and charts are very popular in the fantasy football space. So I think that tool is a great idea for those out there that do not know where to begin with setting boundaries.
The important thing to remember is your boundaries are yours and yours alone. So it is up to you to establish and enforce them. Enforcing boundaries is easier said than done, especially when it comes to cutting out a relationship entirely. At that point, the relationship has become toxic and you've held on to the relationship for far too long out of love or obligation, such as dedication to family members, significant time and effort put into a friendship or partnership, or overcommitting at work without the expected benefits. Constantly evaluating your boundaries will allow you to intervene in problems before they become too problematic or toxic.
Thank you, Megan, for sharing so much valuable information about setting boundaries. Thank you all out there for joining us today. We hope you were able to get some information from this that will help you or someone else you know. We'll be back next Monday at 9 a.m. for episode 11 to discuss communication through conflict. Again, the best way to watch this series is to subscribe to the Fantasy and Frames YouTube channel. If you are struggling or having suicidal thoughts, then immediately call or text 988. That is the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline and is available 24/7. Thank you all again, and we'll see you all next week.